Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching vSphere Multi-Hypervisor Manager, or MHM. Before I show you what VMware's Multi-Hypervisor Manager can do and walk you through the process of installing it and using it, let's first answer the question, why should you use Multi-Hypervisor to begin with, or at all? The idea of running multiple hypervisors in the data center has become quite popular in the technology media and also with third-party companies who are really, in my opinion, just striving to stay ahead of their competition and to ensure that their product is going to support Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V as the popularity for that hypervisor increases. But why should you use multi-hypervisor in the data center? Well, in my opinion, most likely you don't want to unless perhaps you are a value-added reseller or a consultant or a technology instructor, or perhaps your company is in a budget crunch or you're just trying to find ways to save money for the company, because really the number one reason that most traditional companies would consider using multiple hypervisors is simply to save money on VMware vSphere licensing costs. That's because it's going to add additional complexities, it's going to make administrators less efficient. But that said, with tools like VMware's vSphere Multi-Hypervisor Manager, those inefficiencies and complexities can be lessened or reduced, but not fully eliminated. In many cases, companies use multiple hypervisors in the data center while they're performing a conversion. Let's say they're converting from Hyper-V to vSphere or from vSphere to Hyper-V. In other words, they have some transition going on from one hypervisor to the other. On the other hand, if they're going to have multiple hypervisors around for the long term, tools like Multi-Hypervisor Manager can also help them not only convert, but in the long-term situation or scenario, inventory Hyper-V virtual machines and perform simple common administration tasks on those virtual machines. If you're looking for a long-term multi-hypervisor tiering solution, where let's say you have vSphere as your tier 1 and Hyper-V as your tier 2 solution, and you want to be able to easily move virtual machines from one tier to the other, I can tell you that VMware's Multi-Hypervisor Manager is not going to be that solution. It doesn't do that well. It will help, again, with basic, simple administration tasks, but it will not help you to, let's say, create a new Hyper-V virtual machine from a VMware vSphere template, and it won't help you to drag and drop or easily move a Hyper-V virtual machine to vSphere or a vSphere virtual machine to Hyper-V if all of a sudden you want to change the tiers of some of the applications running in this multi-hypervisor virtual infrastructure. Now let me give you an introduction to vSphere Multi-Hypervisor Manager before I jump in and show you how to download it, install it, and use it. Here's a diagram from the VMware website, and it shows how if we start at the top, we've got the vSphere client. This is the Windows-based vSphere client. It's there that you're going to install a Multi-Hypervisor Manager client plugin. From there, you'll be talking to vCenter as you normally would, but there's an MHM extension involved in the vCenter communication there. So the client plugin's talking to the extension, and then the extension's talking to the Multi-Hypervisor Manager server, which in turn is talking to your Hyper-V hosts and Hyper-V virtual machines. Here's what Multi-Hypervisor Manager, or MHM, can do for you. It can provision new virtual machines on Hyper-V, edit Hyper-V virtual machine configurations, integrate authentication and vCenter security roles, discover new Hyper-V virtual machines automatically. It can power on and power off Hyper-V virtual machines, connect, disconnect CD or DVD drives, and even install guest operating systems. It now does support Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V if you use the latest version, which is Beta 1.1 at the time that I'm creating this lesson. And it can also migrate Hyper-V virtual machines into vSphere, again, if you're using Beta 1.1. And that's what I'll be using to demonstrate Multi-Hypervisor Manager in this lesson. So what can't Multi-Hypervisor Manager do for you? Well, at this point, it doesn't allow you to access the Hyper-V virtual machine consoles. So I know that I said you could connect CD and DVD drives and potentially install the guest operating systems. but at this point, I guess that's a little bit of a stretch. You're not going to be able to really access the console to answer the questions related to the guest OS installs. I assume if you had a fully scripted installation where you could simply connect the boot device and it would actually install, then yes, you might be able to install the guest OS, or if you did a Pixie boot, you could install the guest OS. But if you can't answer the questions related to the installation on the console, you're going to have trouble installing that guest OS. So hopefully that's a feature that comes here very soon. You also can't run vCenter reports or use third-party virtualization management tools on these Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines that are managed with Multi-Hypervisor Manager. In other words, the Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines are not accessible through the vCenter API in the same way that vSphere hosts and virtual machines would be. There are third-party tools such as Hotlink Supervisor that will allow you to run vCenter reports and even third-party tools on Hyper-V virtual machines and hosts, just as if they were VMware vSphere hosts and virtual machines. Hotlink does have a free version that is limited in scale, and then they have a full paid commercial version that supports multiple hypervisors and even cloud-based infrastructure as a service solutions. And how it works is it fools VMware vCenter into thinking that all of those hypervisors and virtual machines and cloud solutions are actually VMware vSphere hosts and virtual machines. Now, coming back to VMware vSphere Multi-Hypervisor Manager, today it does not support hypervisors other than Hyper-V or Microsoft Windows Hyper-V, but VMware has said that they will soon be supporting other hypervisors such as XenServer, KVM, or Red Hat Enterprise Linux. As I mentioned earlier, because Multi-Hypervisor Manager uses a Windows-based vSphere client plugin, there is no way to make Multi-Hypervisor Manager work with the vSphere web client. Alright, so how do you deploy and use VMware's Multi-Hypervisor Manager? Let's first go over to the VMware website, and I'll show you exactly where you download it, some of the resources that are available, and then we'll deploy it into the virtual infrastructure at the Wirebrain Coffee Company, where they happen to have a couple Windows servers using Microsoft Hyper-V that we can then manage with VMware's Multi-Hypervisor Manager. The VMware community for VMware vCenter Multi-Hypervisor Manager, or MHM, is very well put together. There are discussions, documents, frequently asked questions, release notes. There's also a VMworld video where they interview the product manager and an installation video out here. So here you see the same diagram and then a number of different questions related to Multi-Hypervisor Manager. In my case, I'm going to use the beta by clicking here to download it, but I should tell you, normally Multi-Hypervisor Manager will be on the same download page where you go and download VMware vCenter. So look for it over there because the beta might not always be available and you might not be able to download it from here. So again, look for it wherever you download VMware vCenter. So I'm just going to go ahead and click here to download vCenter Multi-Hypervisor Manager Beta. And here you see VMware vCenter Multi-Hypervisor Manager Beta 1.1. We've got a couple pieces to download here. Here is also the license file. So we really just have two files to download. I'm going to go ahead and download those. While those are downloading, let's go perform a necessary configuration change over on one of the Windows servers that we'll be managing with VMware Multi-Hypervisor Manager. Here I am on one of my Windows servers that will be managing with Multi-Hypervisor Manager. This server already has Hyper-V installed, and the required configuration we need to make here is to enable the WinRM listener. The WinRM listener is for Windows Remote Management, and it's used by the vCenter Multi-Hypervisor Manager service for managing Hyper-V on the Hyper-V host. So this has to be enabled, and you can choose either HTTP or HTTPS, with HTTPS being the more secure option. But to use HTTPS, you'll have to create a self-signed certificate. There's information on how to do that in the Multi-Hypervisor Manager guide on page 16, so I won't go into the HTTPS configuration. The simplest configuration is just to use HTTP, although it's also not as secure. To enable the WinRM listener using HTTP, the easiest thing is just to type WinRM space quick config. I'll press enter here, And it says that WinRM is already set up to receive requests on this machine, but it's not set up to allow remote access to this machine for management. So that's what we're enabling here. It says to create a WinRM listener on http://*, basically accepting all WinRM requests, going to any IP on this machine, and enable the WinRM firewall exception. Just type Y right here for yes to make the changes. It tells us that WinRM has been updated for remote management. The WinRM listener is running, and the firewall exception has been made if your firewall is enabled. So that's something that you'll have to do on each of your Hyper-V hosts for the vCenter Multi-Hypervisor Manager service to access them and remotely manage the Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines. With this configuration made, now let's go back and check on the status of those vCenter Multi-Hypervisor Manager executables that we're downloading so we can get started with the installation. I've downloaded the new beta Multi-Hypervisor Manager service/extension as well as the client. To start the installation, I'm first going to install the Multi-Hypervisor client on my local workstation where I'm running my VMware vSphere client. Of course, we won't be able to test it or use it until we install the server side of Multi-Hypervisor Manager. To install it, I'll just double click. We get a warning message here in Windows 8. I'll click Run Anyway. And this walks us through the quick, easy, typical Windows installation. I'll just click Next here, accept the patent agreement, accept the beta license agreement in this case, then click Install. And there we go. With that quick installation done, I'll click Finish. And the next piece we want to install is the server side. Over here on my vCenter server, I've actually already copied the Multi-Hypervisor Manager server-side piece to the desktop of the vCenter server. I'll just double-click it to run. Again, it's a relatively small, relatively standard Windows installation. I'll just click Next here to continue and start the installation, accept the end-user patent, accept the beta license agreement, take the default installation directory. I'll choose to automatically generate a certificate. And then here I need to enter the host name and credentials to access our vCenter server. With that in place, I'll click Next. I'll accept the SSL certificate here. And then here I need to put in an administrative account that has rights to run the Multi-Hypervisor Manager as a service on this local host. So what I'll do is I'll put in Wired Brain Coffee, domain, and then the administrator account, because I know it has rights to run Multi-Hypervisor Manager as a service. So I'll just click Next here. We'll take the default ports and the name for the vCenter server and click Next. You can choose here to use a converter standalone server if you would like. We're not going to choose that option, but that would be for virtual machine conversions that you're converting from Hyper-V to vSphere. Finally, we'll click Install. And the main thing you needed to know there were really just the vCenter server credentials and then an account that has the rights to run the Multi-Hypervisor Manager service on this server. So it'll take just a second to install it. And there we go. Finish. We are done. I'll click Finish here. Now let's go ahead and run the vSphere client. Of course, we could run it locally on the vCenter server. We could also run it, on a remote workstation wherever we installed the vSphere Multi-Hypervisor Manager plugin. I should note I've actually already installed the vSphere client plugin for the Multi-Hypervisor Manager on the vCenter server as well. So we'll log in as administrator. We've got an ESX host there and some virtual machines. Let's go to the home screen. And then notice here we do not yet have the Multi-Hypervisor Manager addition or plugin. To get that, I'll go up here to Plugins and down to Manage Plugins. If we scroll down, this is what we want right here, the vCenter Multi-Hypervisor Manager version 1.1. In this case, I'll click Download and Install. That takes just a minute. I'll click Run here. and then the installation of the plugin into the vSphere client begins. I'll click Next here. It tells us that a reboot may be required on this client workstation. If it's a vCenter server, that's something you're going to have to take into account if it's a production server. I'll say OK in this case because this is a lab environment. Click Finish. And then I'll need to restart this host, and that may be only because I was doing an upgrade, actually, of Multi-Hypervisor Manager. I had a previous version running on this server, so keep that in mind. You may not actually have to do a reboot when you install a brand new version of Multi-Hypervisor Manager. Back on my vCenter server, let's go ahead and run the vSphere client. We'll log in. On the home screen of the vSphere client, notice the new icon we've got right here. It says vCenter Multi-Hypervisor Manager. This is all thanks to the vSphere client plugin we installed and the vSphere Multi-Hypervisor Manager service we installed. So if we double-click on this, this brings us a new inventory tree here that looks very similar to the vCenter hosts and clusters inventory, but soon we'll have Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines over here in this inventory underneath VMware vCenter. So the first thing we need to do is to add a third-party host. In this case, that third-party host is going to be a Windows either 2008 or 2012 Hyper-V server. I do have running a Hyper-V 2008 R2 server. I'm just going to provide the IP address, or of course you can do DNS name and username and password for that. It tells us that Multi-Hypervisor Manager makes the connection to that host using HTTP, and thus it's not encrypted. So we'll need to say OK here to accept that. And look at that. It tells us it found a host. There's the host name. There's the vendor. There's the model and family of the server and the version of the operating system that it's running. It is a 2008 R2 server. And hey, it does have some virtual machines. In fact, one of them is actually vCenter. Yes, I'm guilty. I'm running vCenter over there as a virtual machine inside Hyper-V to manage my vSphere virtual infrastructure. I'll click Next here. It tells us it's going to add this new host with this version of the operating system, this network called Local Area Network Virtual Network, and this data store called C:. Yes, it's a Windows file system called C:. I'll click Finish here. We've got a new plus sign. Let's expand this out. We're currently adding the new host and virtual machines. And there we go. Let's click on the host. Let's get rid of the Getting Started tab here. It tells us this is a Dell server. It's a PowerEdge T110 with 8 CPUs of 3.2 gigahertz each. An Intel 64-bit CPU. There's actually one physical CPU here and 8 virtual CPUs. So it's a 8-core CPU with a total of 8 logical processors. There's 3 virtual machines, 1 physical NIC, and it is connected. Notice I also get information about CPU and memory resource utilization here. It's got 16 gigs of RAM with about half of that currently utilized. I also get NTFS file system information here. So from here I can actually shut down this host, reboot it. I can create a new virtual machine. I can go to the virtual machines tab and see what virtual machines are out there. I can see the different columns I can look at here. I can sort those virtual machines by their power state, provision space, CPU utilization. I can go to configuration for the host, look at memory, networking, processors, network adapters, go to tasks and events for the host, of which currently there are none, and then also permissions. I can use VMware roles and permissions here to control the administration of the Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines. If I go to one of the virtual machines, notice I can see the guest operating system, the number of virtual CPUs that are allocated, the amount of memory, IP address, DNS host name, state, the host that it's running on, the guest operating system tools, information about resource utilization here, shut down the virtual machine, suspend, edit the settings, or even convert with VMware vCenter Converter. Now that wasn't something we installed, but it's certainly possible. Here I can click Edit Settings, and I can go in, and since the virtual machine is on, I can't edit, of course, the memory, but I could on a powered off virtual machine. I can also go to options and rename the virtual machine if I chose to do that, or let's say connect or disconnect network adapters. Something else I can do is check on tasks and events for the virtual machine and also assign permissions. If I right click on the virtual machine, I have very similar settings, including convert here, but notice something that's missing is access to the console like you get with a vSphere virtual machine. Of course, I know the IP address of the virtual machine, so I could, let's say, connect to it, hopefully using RDP, but even though I could connect an ISO like Windows 2012 server image here for an installation, I can't actually access the virtual machine console and answer the questions related to the installation. So Multi-Hypervisor Manager has a number of benefits, including visibility and basic administration of these Hyper-V virtual machines and hosts, but it also still lacks a few things, including console access and also integration of these Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines with the vSphere hosts and virtual machines so that I can see all this information in one place, and then of course also access to the virtual machine consoles. Now the beta version that we're testing here, version 1.1, does have some increased functionality like converting virtual machines and then also the ability to administer Windows Server 2012 Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines. So some great improvements, but still a little ways to go on this multi-hypervisor management product from VMware that's included free with vSphere 5.1. So with that successful installation and demonstration of Multi-Hypervisor Manager, let's go back to our slides. And with that, we've reached the end of this lesson on VMware vSphere Multi-Hypervisor Manager. Thanks for watching.